Oliver Twist 3.
Just as Oliver was about to start his story, Mr. Grimwig, a friend of Mr. Brownlow's, came to visit. Mr. Grimwig was an old gentleman who loved to argue with other people. He was also struck by Oliver's features. Mr. Brownlow wanted to listen to Oliver's story in private, so he asked Oliver if he would come and tell his story the following morning. In the meantime, Mr. Brownlow wanted some books returned to the bookstore. Oliver offered to return them, and Mr. Brownlow agreed to let Oliver go. He was sure that Oliver was honest. Oliver took the books, as well as a 5-pound note with which to pay for some other books. "He'll be back soon," Mr. Brownlow said. "He'll never come back," said Mr. Grimwig. Nancy saw Oliver on the street and grabbed hold of him. Bill Sikes, who had been drinking in a nearby pub, took Oliver back to Fagin's. Everyone was happy to see him, especially as he had new clothes, books, and money. "You may keep me here for the rest of my life," Oliver begged, "but please send Mr. Brownlow's things back to him. He will think I'm a liar and a thief." Fagin smiled. "That's perfect for us." Fagin started hitting Oliver with a club, but Nancy tried to stand up for Oliver and protect him. She snatched the club from Fagin and threw it in the fire. "I'm warning you, Fagin. I'll kill you and Bill if you beat the boy." Oliver was told to wear his old clothes again, the very same ones he had given away. Fagin had happened to come by them. Mr. Brownlow was worried about Oliver. He put an advertisement in the newspaper offering a reward for information on Oliver. That same day, Mr. Bumble, a parish officer in Oliver's hometown, visited London on business. His job was taking care of the poor in the parish, but he had treated Oliver badly. Mr. Bumble read the advertisement and guessed the boy was Oliver. He decided to visit Mr. Brownlow to get the reward. Mr. Bumble told Mr. Brownlow that Oliver was a villain. Mr. Brownlow was saddened by such news. Mrs. Bedwin would not believe that Oliver was bad. Mr. Grimwig, however, said he knew all along that Oliver was rotten. "Never mention the boy's name again in my house," ordered Mr. Brownlow. Oliver was kept prisoner by Fagin, who intended to turn him into a thief. Fagin persuaded Bill Sikes to use Oliver to break into a house. One day, Nancy visited Fagin's house and told Oliver to come with her. "Oliver, I've saved you once, and I will again. But this is not the time to escape." Nancy said this so seriously that Oliver walked obediently over to Sikes's house. The next night, Sikes, his partner in crime, and Oliver broke into the house. But the people in the house woke up when they heard noises. Oliver was shot. Sikes and his partner tried to carry Oliver away, but Sikes ended up throwing Oliver in a ditch before running away. Sikes hoped Oliver would die. Meanwhile, Mr. Bumble was visiting the matron of the poorhouse where Oliver had been born. Her husband had died a long time ago. A short time afterward, Mr. Bumble and the matron got married. Mrs. Bumble happened to acquire a precious locket from a woman who had actually stolen it from Oliver's dying mother. Fagin tried to find Sikes, but he ended up meeting with a man called Monks. Actually, Monks was Oliver's half-brother, and he wanted Oliver destroyed. Monks had asked Fagin to force Oliver into a life of crime. Meanwhile, Oliver was being well looked after by the owner of the property that he had broken into. Mrs. Maylie, who had been surprised to discover that the robber was only a boy, had decided to take care of Oliver. Mrs. Maylie took Oliver to stay in the countryside with her niece, Rose. Oliver enjoyed his time with Rose and Mrs. Maylie. Rose was in poor health, but she was a woman with a very kind heart. Oliver grew very fond of Rose.